morning. My name is Richard Lee. I'm a partner in our McKinsey Seoul office leading our high-tech and telecom practice.
And I'm Richard Dobbs. I'm also a partner with McKinsey in Korea, and I also lead the McKinsey Global Institute, long-term business and economics research group. We've done a number of bits of research recently on big data, the internet, and the Internet of Things.
When SBS asked us to talk about the smart world in 10 years, well, we thought this was an impossible task. Frankly, every 3 years, high-tech is changing. No one knows what the next iPhone will be like. So what we did was we did three things. We asked our partners globally, what are the top issues we're working on with our clients in high-tech and telecom? We have a proprietary consumer survey, which we did, of 5,000 consumers in Korea and 10 other countries. And finally, we looked at some of the leading trends from the discussions that are going on. And what we want to do today is talk about 10 trends that we think are the most important trends in the smart world for the next 10 years. And in the end, we want to talk about four key implications and predictions for you to take away. So what we've done is we've organized the 10 trends along three important buckets. First, we wanted to see what the most important consumer changes are. We want to understand how technology will change. And finally, how that will translate into new business models. Richard Dobbs and I will alternate on these different trends, and I will close off with the most important implications for us. And we will also take questions and answers at the end.
It's often said that it's very difficult to make predictions, especially about the future. But actually, with demographics, you can be very certain. Because the people who are going to be adults in 20 years' time are already been born. So when we look at the demographics, we can see some fundamental change underpinning the world over the next 20 years. First of all, urbanization. The world now lives in, over half the world now lives in cities. First point ever in history. And more importantly, when we think about cities, cities are going to contribute 80% of GDP growth over the next few years. The second area of demographics is the industrial revolution that is now happening in emerging markets. When Europe and the US, before the European US industrial revolution, India and China used to be 50% of the global economy. The industrial revolution happened in Europe and is now happening in India and China. And as a result, when we look at economic growth over the next 20 years, over half of the economic growth in terms of consumption is going to be happening in emerging markets. And the third demographic change is aging. So you can see on this chart, by 2050, 35% of the people in OECD countries are going to be over the age of 60. How the older people buy is going to be very important. The next page just shows where the growth is going to come from. If you look at things like medical services, almost 100% is that going to come from the over 50s in the US. And even in areas like high tech, half of the growth is going to come from this older age group. So part of the challenge as we think about the new digital world is not a digital world for 20-year-olds, it's a digital world for over 50s. And I think here in Korea, we can see how that's already happening.
The second big trend is obviously social networks. Now, this is not new for the participants in this audience, and we've also heard from many of the leading social networks in Korea. We know already that more than 30% of the global internet population is on social networks, including Facebook. Now, what we want to talk about in social networks is a slightly different phenomenon. It's not just the fact that people are using social networks. People are using a lot of social networks. We find that users of Facebook spend 6 times more hours per month than on Google. But not only the hours, we also find that people using social networks are increasingly using social networks instead of traditional search engines. For example, last year we were able to find that the leading sites, such as the New York Times or Amazon, are reached by social networks rather than search engines. We see that Google has seen a decline in people reaching these sites through Google, whereas Facebook at the same time has seen a doubling of traffic. So we see social networking not as a way of just sharing pictures or communicating with friends, but it's becoming the next portal, the next discovery point for new information and commerce.
So let's move to our third trend, which is the innovation and how people connect to the internet and to the wired world. Obviously, the theme of the conference is around connectivity. I want to highlight two fundamental changes in the way connectivity is going to work. First of all, augmented reality has been talked about for a long time. It's been in science fiction films for even longer. However, it is now becoming a reality driven by better connectivity of devices, and for augmented reality to work, devices need to be connected to the internet more effectively, and also the installation of cameras in devices and location sensors. So augmented reality will become a new part of the way that we're going to get connected. And we can already see examples of being able to use augmented reality on a Galaxy Tab, for instance, to look at places and to be able to look up what places are. A very different way of searching for things. The second change in terms of how we connect is through the streaming. So you can see on this chart, we've got a huge growth in streaming. Netflix, for instance, is 30% of data downloads in the US. Now, the reality is, as you move from a connected through DVDs or connected through books or things that have been static to something where things are coming in to you live, the fundamental way of things will change in terms of the way content gets delivered, in the way that people think about activities. You no longer have to have something that was put together years ago because it had to be put on a DVD that had to be mailed to you. You can have live information being fed to you. In the US, for instance, Ustream website has 2 million registered users with over 10 million unique hits per month. People looking at webcams, people looking at individual broadcast shows. Now, while at the moment that is a PC phenomenon, as we move towards more connectivity of mobiles and tablet platforms, that's going to become a bigger thing. So the way we connect is going to be a fundamental change going forward as we move towards greater streaming and greater augmented reality.
So we spoke about the consumer trends. We spoke about the aging of the consumer. We spoke about the emerging markets. We spoke about the impact of social networking beyond sharing photos. And we spoke about augmented reality as a new way for consumers to connect. We'd like to move on to technology. And we think actually this is probably the most important area of innovation in the next 10 years. I'd like to first talk about what we see as one of the biggest trends in technology, which is the resurgence of the web. Actually, last fall, Wired magazine, one of the premier magazines in high tech, has declared that the internet was dead. The web was dead. If you think about the way you use your Galaxy tablet or your smartphones, people check the weather, read the news through applications that are downloaded on your device. People don't use the browsers anymore. So they're actually predicting that the web would actually die down. Just the next month, MIT Technology Review said quite the opposite, that the web was reborn. And what they were talking about was how the internet would come back, the web would come back with a set of new standards known as HTML5. Now, we think this is very important because what we see now is we see a proliferation of many different types of technology. Just in this audience right now, we see people using the iPhone, we see people using Android, we also see tablets. We see operating systems for tablets based on Honeycomb. We see Microsoft coming up with a different standard for their own operating system for phones. We see a proliferation of operating systems in tablets, phones, and PCs. But in the end, we think that will not matter because what will happen was there will be a new standard based on HTML, which will allow you to run across different platforms. And this is actually happening for the first time in 10 years since this HTML has been defined. So what we're seeing right now is a common set of standards which allow people to develop things like video applications, gaming, all kinds of different applications just by using a simple browser. Google, just a couple weeks ago, launched a new kind of operating system altogether called Chrome, which is simply a browser. You turn on the PC turns on in 10 seconds, and you just get a browser thinking that the whole world, your whole experience can be done via the HTML standard. And we think this is a very profound change that can really make this notion of standards more important across different platforms. And we think that this can allow developers to reach a whole range of audiences across different operating systems and across different devices. This can also fundamentally change and disrupt certain industries. For example, if you look at the gaming industry today, more than half of the value is taken by middlemen, by distributors, by retailers. One of the biggest trends in gaming, or one of the biggest fears, is that this could be disrupted by allowing people to distribute gaming directly from the developers to the consumers and keep over 50% of the margins. We also see another very important trend around components. Now, when Steve Jobs developed the iPhone and introduced it in 2007, he probably would have never asked consumers what they wanted. What he realized was the most important technology trend was the innovation in touchscreens. Capacitive touchscreens were coming to a point where they could be produced at very low cost. If you think about the Korean companies in particular, this is probably the most important factor that we would recommend companies look at. It's not just about software. Everyone talks about contents and software. We actually think about the other way. Look at the most critical components that are affecting innovation today. We see some of that already around 3D without glasses or near-field communications, around super intelligent computers. But we also think that there are more innovations down the line, such as flexible displays. If you think about some of the most innovative products coming out, it's because of individual components, such as flexible screens, long battery life, that will really power the next generation of innovation. So we would encourage a lot of the companies to look at this as a key source of distinction going forward.
Our sixth trend is the emergence of machine-to-machine communication and the analysis of big data. As we look at machine-to-machine connectivity, that provides a huge opportunity to connect machines and to actually have the machines make decisions without having to have a human interface. We now see 100 billion devices that are connecting to each other. This becomes a bigger thing. The Internet of Things is a bigger activity than the Internet of People. And as machines to machines connect, there's an opportunity for them to start analyzing data at a level of huge depth. Next slide, please. So if we look at the underlying data that comes out from this connectivity of machines, there's an opportunity to improve profitability. We've just published a report looking at the Internet of Things and the big data, and we believe that if you look at retailers, for instance, it's possible to increase profitability by about 60% through better analysis of the underlying data being generated at the retail site. We believe it's possible for hospital systems to save, in the US, to save $300 billion of cost each year by being better at analyzing the data that comes out and being able to use that data to make decisions about the level of drugs that are provided. There are, though, a major challenge. Next slide, please. In terms of doing this. We think there's, in the United States alone, between 140,000 and 190,000 shortage of people who are able to do this type of analysis. The analysis required, the analysis connecting to think about how to connect machines to machines, and the analysis required to analyze the big data. This is going to be a huge source of advantage for people who can build up that talent and to be able to work out how to use it. You could argue in a big data world, statistics suddenly become sexy again.
Actually, just to add to Richard's point on big data, we had Eric Schmidt as our keynote speaker in the McKinsey Partners Conference 2 months ago. His number one advice for McKinsey was to build up an analytics center to take advantage of this big data and really figure out the treasure of opportunities by being able to go to petabytes of information. We'd like to push that even further. We think that the next big trend will also be around form factors. Right now, people carry tablets, they also have a PC, they also have a smartphone. In the future, we think that boundaries will become more and more blurry. For example, Motorola just announced a smartphone called the Atrix this year, which allows you to slot into a dumb terminal with a monitor and a screen and a keyboard. And it effects then becomes a PC. Now, of course, there are still many challenges. It's still not a full PC. It's basically a handset that's being blown up into a big screen. But we at McKinsey did a survey with the CIOs in the United States, where they said over 45% of them would support this kind of a form factor in the future, where they would allow their employees to have one device, which can be a phone or a PC, just by slotting into different machines. We also see a similar trend between tablets and PCs. ASUS just introduced a PC or tablet called the Transformer. and literally transforms between a tablet or a notebook PC by slotting a keyboard. We see innovations happening in Microsoft as well next year when they will be launching Windows 8. And from what they've announced so far, Windows 8 will become much more like a tablet, supporting lower powered processors based on ARM processors, supporting a variety of new interfaces, potentially sensors. And so what becomes a PC, what becomes a tablet, or what becomes a smartphone, in our view, will become more and more blurry.
The next trend is around the interaction of social, mobile, and search and local activities, the so-called SOLO-MO world, a term coined by John Doerr of Kleiner Perkins. So we think about how these activities combine and how they change the business system. We're going to see them moving from about communicating to consumers up front to all the way through the business system and fundamentally changing the business system of how people interact with customers and how they sell to customers and how they transact afterwards. When we looked at a sample of developed economies, 13 developed economies, we found that 20% of GDP growth in those countries came from the SOLO-MO world, this interaction in there. We also found that in terms of jobs, 500,000 jobs disappeared in these countries as the internet and the other types of connectivity activity, we go to the next slide, worked down the business chain and changed the way that worked. Activities that used to require lots of people were done by machines. Now, the bad news is that while 500,000 jobs disappeared, the good news is that we found that the internet and the other activities in the SOLO-MO world created 1.2 million jobs. These were different jobs, different skill capabilities, and there's a huge training challenge of making people migrate from one to another. But the internet actually created more jobs than it destroyed in these countries.
We also see new business models emerging in the vertical or industry trends. We just heard about how people don't read anymore. Well, actually, we hope that people are reading on e-textbooks. One of the biggest change what we see right now are there are several industries that are looking to be disrupted because of these new devices. At McKinsey, we're actually working on a project looking at how tablets can be used to disrupt industries such as healthcare, insurance, and education. Within education alone, we see a tremendous opportunity to disrupt the e-book or e-textbook space. Many of you who have been educated in the US will know that textbooks in the United States cost more than $100 to $200, depending on the subject. Now, if you can put them into e-textbooks, you can introduce new business models. For example, there are companies such as CourseSmart and Inkling who offer $30 textbook rentals that you can rent for 6 months, and then the DRM no longer allows you to access that textbook after the 6-month period. Now, this doesn't also take into the fact that your books will be much lighter, you'll have interactivity. Already, we see in the other books, Amazon is outselling ebooks over regular books. In the United States, of the 2 major bookstore chains, one of them is going bankrupt. So we see a fundamental shift in education alone where these tablet solutions can introduce new business models.
The final trend is at the bottom of the pyramid. The previous speaker talked about how a computer in Calcutta slum gets used by people. And that, we think, is also going to be a big element. So a lot of the trends we talked at the moment so far have been at the top end. We think at the bottom of the pyramid, there's going to be huge impact. There's, for instance, M-Pesa, which is a money transfer scheme via SMS. Parts of the world where there isn't banking, there is a mobile phone system. And in terms of the ability for people to transfer money and to make payments, the banking system is actually being supplanted by the SMS system. The phone system is able to make these transfers, allow people to withdraw money, make payments via their phones, etc. Novatum, in this page, shows an interesting business model for getting computing to frontline places in rural parts of the world, such as India. This is it's a company based in Chennai in India. It offers cloud computing service based on very, very low-cost PCs, almost like a Google Chrome PC, for instance. For about $10 a month, it's possible to provide an integrated internet with a low-cost PC for a consumer. $100 up front gives you internet access, ability to do work through web-based activities. So it's possible to get some of these activities completely to the front line in terms of rural parts of the world in a way that hasn't been possible historically. So that's the 10 trends. Richard's now going to try and summarize 4 ideas of what this means in the connected world.
So what does this mean? We'd like to leave you with 4 thoughts. First of all, first and foremost, before we talk about any innovation, we need to talk about the 50% of the world that needs to be reached via smart devices. That 50% is the 50% of the growth that's coming from emerging markets, and 50% of the growth that's coming from those who are 60 and older. So the innovation has to go for the next 1 billion consumers, no matter how you look at this. Number 2 is what we call the convergence of devices. As we mentioned before, this notion of a phone or a PC or a tablet, we think will be less and less relevant in the future. We think there's opportunity to think about new classes of devices that function in many different ways. Number 3, we think there's a big disruption coming back with the web. People are saying, are you part of the Android camp? Are you part of the Windows camp? Are you part of Apple? In the future, it's all about the web again. We feel that the web will introduce and democratize the way you think about applications and experiences across different platforms. For example, today, there's a different operating system for a PC and a mobile. Why should that exist in the future? Finally, with all these different sensors and devices in the world, the smart world that we've been talking about is still mainly in the virtual world. And we think that the smart world will move increasingly to the physical world, reducing the boundaries between what is virtual and what is physical. So these are the 4 takeaways we have. We have about 8 minutes for questions, so we open up the audience, and we'll be happy to answer any questions before we finish off.
사이트론의 시스코베 기창진 박사입니다. 제가 질문하고 싶은 거는 지난 히스토리에 반영해서 이번에 프리딕션이 얼마나 정확한지 히스토리컬 데이터를 한번 알고 싶습니다.
The question was whether we have any historical data to show how accurate we are in our predictions.
Yeah, we do. Mobile phones, we got completely wrong. We thought in, I think it was 1985, but by 1995 or so, maybe it was 2000, we thought there'd be about 1 million mobile phones. So we typically make the same mistake that many do, which is underestimating trends to begin with, and then, overestimating trends to begin with and underestimating them eventually. I think there's an important point, though, about this, which is about testing robustness of decisions. Because the reality is, even if there had been 10 million phones or 100 million or whatever, the direction was quite clear that this was becoming a growing area, and it was important to be in that industry and get ready for the trend. So one of the things we actually do encourage people to do is to test the robustness of strategy and other choices to different worlds. So, you say, we think this is what's going to happen. What happens if the web comes back? What happens if we move to an app world? What happens if cloud computing collapses under the weight of its streaming costs? And understand what that means, and then test the robustness of any business strategy decision to reflect that.
Throughout this presentation, you really haven't touched upon the security issue, which is becoming more keener and keener, especially in Korean society. You don't think it's a factor? You think people are not really that concerned about this? Can you touch upon this?
Sure. No, absolutely. It is a big factor. And as you have seen the recent hacking cases with the Sony PlayStation network and other high-profile cases within Korea as well, it's certainly an issue. For us, that's an ongoing issue. It's not a fundamental change in the trends. So what we focused on in these top 10 trends are ideas of what are the things that would change in the next 10 years in the smart world, changes in the form factor or changes in the demographics. We believe security will be an ongoing issue in terms of the importance and not change in terms of the importance itself. With the emergence of cloud-based OS, for example, with Google, that's the #1 concern as well. If you put your entire life on the cloud, there's nothing stored on your PC. How can you trust the security and the viability of the data that's on the cloud. So absolutely is a very important trend, but we think that's an ongoing trend rather than a new trend.
In fact, I mean, you could argue there are sort of three constraints that could hit these trends. This is where the world's going to go, but there are three things that are going to potentially hold it up. One is security and concerns on security. Secondly, talent. I mentioned the need of nearly 200,000 data miners in the US alone to be able to deal with that. If we don't get the right talent and the right capabilities repositioned to this new world, the constraint at which it moves forward. And the third area is infrastructure. We talk about a cloud-based activity, and anyone who's tried to use a mobile phone to download data, even in Korea, let alone in New York, if you try and take a car from New York Airport to downtown Manhattan and use a phone that's on a channel the same as an iPhone, your call will drop 6 times. The infrastructure's not there, and that's in a pre-iTunes cloud world. So I think the infrastructure could be the third constraint. So we're going to get some of this new world to happen, we're going to have to address security concerns, address security the way it's addressed, and confidentiality and privacy and all those issues. We're going to have to get a whole bunch of talent retrained into this new world. And thirdly, we're going to have to make a substantial investment in infrastructure to be able to get that world to happen. So those could be the three constraints, and the pace at which we move will be dependent on how well we do against those three.
Thank you. My name is Bryce Simmons and I'm from Ghana. If I understand correctly, one of the ways in which you see the evolution of the device is more or less as an assembly kit, where you can put your smartphone on a dock, remove it, and then it becomes a keyboard, etc., etc. But what do you think of this counter proposal, which is that we will see a greater improvement in the capacity of alternative approaches, such as voice-driven systems, voice recognition systems, virtual accessories or virtual keyboards and the rest of it? Because if that happens, then the convergence is even more interesting, because more of the capability will shift to the network and to the cloud, and therefore my phone, if I could detect noise to my phone and give instructions to produce PowerPoints, etc., I wouldn't need the device assembly approach that you mentioned in the first place. Yeah. I hope I'm making sense.
Sure. Yeah. No, absolutely. I think we're actually saying a very similar point. One of the biggest innovations on the mobile phones is the rapid processing power. Already this year, many of the smartphones are based on dual-core processors. They're about as fast as many of your PCs. And next year, they'll be coming out with quad-core processors on mobile phones. Could you imagine infrared inputs or voice recognition? One of the biggest areas of investments that many of our clients are making is voice recognition, so that you can get 95, 99% accuracy of input via your voice. The other big area around mobile phone is also projection screens. During the Chilean miners, when they were trapped, they were watching movies and soccer games via a smartphone that Samsung sent. This phone has an ability to project 40 inches via a micro projector. So you can imagine your mobile phone can have a 40-inch projection screen, voice recognition. There's all kinds of new possibilities and new business model innovations happening just from that phone. And our point is that because of these innovations, the boundaries between what that is, which is a phone today, versus a PC or a tablet, will become even more blurry.
I mean, on voice recognition, it clearly is going to get there. I think it's probably going to be overhyped at how big it's going to be. I mean, I've been a big fan of it. I remember using voice recognition in the late 90s as an attempt to try and find a way of doing data input. The real problem is if you were all trying to enter stuff into your iPhones or your Galaxies here, we would have a lot of noise in this room, and there's some big privacy issues. It's very easy for you to send a text message. No one can understand what you're saying. No one can listen in on your text messaging. No one, you don't make a lot of noise. But in a lot of settings, voice recognition as a way of putting stuff into a computer is constrained. So there'll be a bunch of activities where it will become dominant, but there'll be a bunch of activities where the old method of putting stuff in through a keyboard or through a mouse or through a touch screen will remain.
I think we're actually out of time. So we hope that this is helpful for you to think through some of the big innovations. So just to remind you, really think about the innovation for the next billion customers. Think about how there will be new classes of devices altogether, not just PCs or phones. Think about the boundaries between the physical and the virtual worlds colliding. and think about all of these implications of the smart world. I think these are some of our parting thoughts. We'd like to thank SPS for co-hosting this with us, and we'd like to have our SPS Secretary General to Secretariat to finalize and close this session. Thank you.